Can I ask you a personal question? Are you happy? Are you happy? Like in your life, are you genuinely happy? Do you have more positive feelings than negative feelings? Or, the people on the other side of you, maybe your spouse or your son or daughter, or maybe your friends or friends at school, or maybe your neighbors, like when they think about you, do they go, oh man, that's a happy guy, or that's a happy gal? Are you happy? Can I ask you another personal question? What makes you happy? What makes you happy? What are the things, happy by definition is, positive feelings, delight, contentment, joy, perpetual joy. What are the things in your life that you would say, man, it's a catalyst, it's a stimulant, it leads to happiness. What are those things in your life that lead to happiness? What makes you happy? You know what makes me happy? I love clean garages. I mean, if my garage is clean, I'm telling you, it just does something inside of me. And currently my garage is not clean. And I'm telling you, every time I go out my garage and I see all this junk around and it's like cluttered over here and cluttered over there and the boys' messes, and I'm like, something inside of me, I'm like, But I'm telling you, if I spend an afternoon, or better yet, if I make my boys spend the afternoon and I supervise, that's kind of fun too, and they clean the whole garage or we clean the whole thing, and then I just stand back out in the driveway, I just cross my arms and I look at a clean garage that looks something like this. Man, there's just contentment. I just feel just that delight and pleasure. It's awesome. You know what else makes me happy? It's when I get to go to lunch with one of my sons. Because when I try to have a conversation with all five of them or one of them while all five of them are present, it's like, dad, 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 dad. And I'm just trying to be intentional with one of them. And it's just so distracting. But when I can go just with one of my sons and have lunch, and this is my son Jonathan, and he's got his peppermint shake from Mighty Fine. And as I just sit on the other side of him, and I see him try to drink that shake, and his cheeks are all sucked in because he's sucking so hard, I just see his little face, and I see his eyes, and I ask him questions and discover things about his heart and discover things about what he's dreaming about. And there's new things that I'm learning as his father. I'm just telling you, man, that delights my heart. That makes me happy. You know what makes me happy? Hanging out with friends. Here's Jill and I, and there's Jill in her Top Gun glasses and her white sweater, and she makes me happy, by the way. But when we go hang out with friends and we just have a fun time and have those experiences, and we can just be ourselves around people we trust, I mean, there's something about that has so much joy. And you know what else? I could go on, but something else I thought I would share with you that makes me happy is my hair. It really does. and for me, growing up, my dad was bald, and so I just thought I'm going to be bald. I mean, he was, bald at a young age. And so I'm going to be bald. But, in middle school, I saw 90210, if you remember that show, and then Dylan had his hair spiked, and I thought if I'm going to be cool, I might as well spike my hair. And then I've used a lot of Aquanet, very cheap hairspray, like level 19 Aquanet, the strongest hold. And I don't know if that's what's kept my hair. I don't know what happened. But there are days that I just look in the mirror, and I get my hair, and it feels just right. That there's just a feeling that I'm like, I like my hair. I love that. That makes me happy. Perhaps I've digressed. So back to you guys. For real. What makes you? Think about your personal life. Think about the things that cause delight, the things that cause enjoyment, the thing that causes just that contentment. What makes you happy? What's interesting is there's so much research on happiness. In fact, I would highly suggest, go seek it out. Go Google happiness. There's great science about it. In fact, there's a gentleman by the name of Dan Gilbert, and he's a Harvard psychologist, and he's got a lot of research on this. In fact, he wrote a book called Stumbling on Happiness. And in his book, he talks about things in terms of the research, just simply data, that blow up our paradigms and what we think are going to make us happy. For example, in his book, he talks about this. He's got a lot of data on lottery winners. And imagine winning $410 million. I mean, you're like, yeah, I'd like to be in that experiment, But he's got all this data on lottery winners, and he's also got a lot of data on people who have become paraplegics. And he looked at both of the data points, and he says, here's what the research says, is after 12 months, after a year, there is absolutely no change in happiness. Regardless of the events that happen, if you won the lottery or if you became a paraplegic, after 12 months, your happiness is the exact same, regardless of the circumstances. which should just blow our minds to go, we should feel like we want to push against that and say, hey, again, I want to be part of that lottery experiment, right? But then he goes on, this is pretty fascinating. He says all the things that, we think are going to lead to happiness. He's like, that romantic relationship, if she says yes, that medical report, if it comes back positive or negative, if I make a good grade on that test, if whatever it may have, my relationship with whatever, at the end of the day, all the data comes back to say after 12 months, the events in our life really don't fluctuate or make much of a difference in happiness. In fact, he concludes by saying even traumatic events, and this is really hard for me to get my mind around, but he says the data suggests that almost all traumatic events in our life, tragic events, after 12 months, even though that tragic event happened, your happiness is the same. Which when you read the data, and there's all kinds of, this is just one perspective, one scientist looking at all this research. If you read the data across the board, that's what you find over and over and over. So the question becomes, well, what leads to happiness? I mean, if the things that I'm chasing and the things that I think are going to lead to happiness, I think a natural, you and I are just talking. We're going, well, what leads to happiness? Well, guys, that's what I want to talk about today. Because I really deeply desire for all of us to begin to step into, to begin to experience, to begin to feel not short-term happiness, but to begin to build a foundation that we can all say, man, I'm experiencing perpetual joy, a constant foundation of contentment. So what leads to that? Well, what's really cool is there's a guy who lived 3,000 years ago by the name of Solomon. And Solomon was the third king of Israel. Solomon had a famous dad. His name was King David. And Solomon actually went on a quest and did a lot of experimenting to find the answer to this question. Like, that was his quest. He's like, I'm going to find the answer. What makes you happy? And what's unique about Solomon is he was well positioned. I mean, he had everything that you and I think would lead to happiness. He had bottomless wealth. I mean, if you kind of extrapolated his wealth, he had about $2.1 trillion in today's money. That's a lot of money. That's, hard to comprehend. But he had, bottomless wealth. He had absolute power. He was the most powerful man in the world at that time. He had worldwide fame. People all around the world heard about him and were coming to sit at his feet to learn from Solomon. And Solomon had hundreds and hundreds of wives and the wisdom to manage the hundreds and hundreds of mother-in-laws, which is a whole nother conversation, right? But that was Solomon. And Solomon was smart enough to look around him. And he's looking around and he's seeing this quest, all these people, they're pursuing happiness. I wonder if this will make me happy, or this will make me happy, or this. And he said, you know what? I want to find out once and for all what leads to happiness. Now, you may think, well, that was 3,000 years ago, so what does that really have to do with today? Times have changed. And you're right, times have changed. We have iPhones and dishwashers. But human psyche has not changed. Because as they pursued happiness 3,000 years ago in their context, today we're doing the exact same thing. In fact, universally speaking, regardless of your belief of afterlife or your belief of God, perhaps the number one quest of humanity is, can I find lasting happiness? And so Solomon says, well, I'm going to take all my wealth, I'm going to take all my resources, and I'm going to see if I can achieve happiness, what it takes. And so he does the experiment, and he's the test subject, which is convenient for him. And so he pursues all these things, and as he's pursuing happiness, he keeps running into three predominant things: time, chance, and death. Time, chance, the randomness of this world, and death. And those three things keep trumping his attempt at happiness. And then he writes a whole letter of all his data and research, and it's called Ecclesiastes. And the way he begins Ecclesiastes is quite depressing. I want to show you what he says in his experiments. He starts this way. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem, that's Solomon. He says, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. In case you didn't get it, one more time, everything is meaningless. Now that is a buzzkill. I'm just telling you. Like, really, Solomon? In all your quest and all your attempts, it's just all meaningless? And see, there's a natural thing, and it should be because you're human, I'm human, that wants to push against this conclusion that Solomon has and say, well, I've got some whatabouts. I mean, I'd like to try this. And we may push and we may say, well, what about intelligence? Solomon, I've heard of really smart people, high IQs. I think of Elon Musk. I mean, he's got a really high IQ. I mean, he's doing things to change the world. That's got to lead to happiness. And so Solomon says, well, God's given me a pretty good intelligence. And he goes, I've pursued this. I've leveraged my resources to see if this is what's going to lead to lasting happiness. And here's his conclusion. He says, the greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. In other words, the more I pursue this and the higher IQ, it just feels like it's driving me crazy. And I think about that. That's 3,000 years ago. But then just a few weeks ago, I was listening to a podcast with Elon, and the person who was interviewing Elon, they said, hey, you're changing the world. You're doing amazing things. I mean, everybody must want to be you. And Elon responds, man, no one would want to be me. And the interviewer goes, why? And he goes, it's miserable. He goes, I can't turn it off. I can't sleep. It's always going. There is such grief. And as I heard that podcast, I went, exactly. That's exactly what Solomon says. It's meaningless. And then we go, well, okay, intelligence. Well, what about something else? What about this? What about pleasure? I mean, hey, a little bit of money, a little bit of, fame, a little bit of sex, a little bit of pleasure, a lot of it. I bet that would lead to lasting happiness. Well, Solomon says, okay, well, I went after all of it. I got to the pinnacle of every pleasure you desire. And he says, here's the conclusion. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. Imagine being able to say that yourself. I denied myself nothing my heart desired, no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for all my labors. And then he says, but as I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was also meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. In other words, he goes and goes and goes, and it's just a chasing after the wind. In other words, pleasure fades. I got to chase it. Pleasure fades, and I got to chase the wind, chase the wind. You just can't catch it. Then we go, okay, I guess that makes sense, but what about wisdom? I've read wisdom in the Bible. Wisdom's important. I bet we can find happiness here if we have enough wisdom. Solomon's like, well, God gave me like a quadruple dose of wisdom, and I pursued that as well. And he says, here's my conclusion of the matter. For the wise can see where they're going, but fools walk in the dark. Yet I saw that the wise and the foolish share the same fate. Both will die. And then he continues, he says, so I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value in all my wisdom? This is also meaningless, for the wise and the foolish both die. And then he concludes and says, the wise will not be remembered any longer than the fool. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. His point? Be a fool, who cares? Be wise, who cares? It really doesn't matter at the end of the day, because that's not where you're going to find meaning and happiness in life. And we hear that and we're like, oh, okay. Well, what about this? Solomon, I have felt this. I've experienced this. What about work? If I work, and work, my identity's there. I feel like if I climb the ladder, I get a promotion, if I get more money, I see my 401k, grow. I see my retirement. I see I can get a bigger house and I can get bigger things in life. Work is nice. I think really if we had a legitimate discussion, work has got to be the place. Solomon says, well, I did it. And I'll tell you what you're going to find at the pinnacle of work. He said, some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. This too is meaningless, a great tragedy. And then look at what he says. So what do people get in this life for all their hard work and anxiety? And I don't know about you, but I so relate with what he says next. Their days of labor are filled with pain and grief. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. Have you had those sleepless nights where you're thinking about, oh my gosh, what do I got to do tomorrow? And the stress and the anxiety, and here's the pressure, and here's a big deal we got to close, and oh my gosh. And you're like, man, I like just my mind to shut off so I can have some peace. All of this energy and stress and anxiety. And then he concludes, it's all meaningless. What are you doing? It's chasing the wind. Something that I find quite interesting is I'll meet with individuals, predominantly men, who are later in their career and maybe approaching retirement years. And when I meet with them, I'm like, hey, we're going to meet maybe for an hour or so. And I'm like, hey, tell me a little bit about you. And for about 58 minutes, they're telling me about their job. And let me tell you about, here's where I've worked, and here's the boardrooms I sat in, and here's what I've accomplished, and here's how much money I've raised, and here's my titles, and here's, all the things. And it's kind of like a beating of the chest moment. And I don't blame them. I get that. I've shared, hey, I worked at Dell and I play professional golf and da-da-da-da-da. That's part of it. But 58 minutes of work. And at the end of 58 minutes, I always think to myself, who are you? Who are you? I mean, that's what I'm curious about. And Solomon says, you can chase it. He's going to be chasing the wind. And then we go, well, maybe power? Is that where you can find happiness? And I see people with a lot of power. And I think the power and influence, I mean, Solomon, you had absolute power. There's no one more powerful than you in the world. So you could answer this question. Solomon says, I did. I chased it. Endless crowds stand around him. But then another generation grows up and rejects him too. So it's all meaningless, like chasing the wind. You know, Jill and I, last weekend, we went to Fredericksburg for our 22nd anniversary. And we hadn't been to Fredericksburg in about 20 years. And so a lot has changed, and we had such a great time. It was such a fun place to be, and all the little shops and wineries. It was fantastic. And we get done, and, you know, we're driving home on Sunday afternoon, and it's a little bit like cloudy and dreary. And on our way home, we drive by LBJ's ranch. And it was such a somber moment because I drove by and I looked and there was no cars in the parking lot, no cars by his house, no one's visiting. And I looked at Jill and I said, babe, I don't know, but gosh, I mean, he was the most powerful man in the world, and I wonder what the power came at the expense of. I wonder how many people he had to run over. I wonder his relationship with Ladybird, his wife. I wonder what happened as a result of all that power. I wonder what happened with his, extended family. I wonder what happened with his friends. I go, man, that potentially had to be hard. And then I said to her, I go, and the crazy part about it is no one's there. I mean, if I talk to our boys about LBJ, they go, who? If I talk to most people in a younger generation, they go, who? And now there's a whole new generation fighting for power. I don't care who I have to run over or what I have to say. I must get power. And they've forgotten LBJ. And I tell you, when we were driving home, I went, there's Solomon. It's exactly what he's teaching you and me. It's a chasing the wind. And we could go on and on, but just a couple more. How about righteousness? If I just do the right thing, then I'm going to feel good. If I just check all the right boxes, then I'm going to feel this happiness. Solomon says, well, let me tell you where you're going to land. In this life, good people are often treated as though they were wicked. And the wicked people are often treated as though they were good. This is so meaningless. Again, there's randomness in this world. You could do everything right and not get the reward. And then how about talent? Well, what if I'm the most talented in school, most talented on the field, most talented on social media, most talented when it comes to my profession? Solomon says, well, I was. And I got to the pinnacle, and let me tell you in terms of happiness, I've observed something else under the sun. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race, and the strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy. And those who are educated don't always lead successful life. And then he concludes this way. It's all decided by chance. There's a randomness in this world. You can't defeat it by being in the right place at the right time. And he just goes on and on throughout the entire letter. Quite depressing. So if you want to be depressed, read the letter of Ecclesiastes. But at the end, as I read the letter and just thought about everything Solomon's teaching us about this quest for happiness, I thought, it really is a chasing the wind. As I thought about all the science and all the research that's out on happiness, it's like chasing the wind. It's like this endless pursuit of something we cannot fully obtain. And as I thought about that, a visual came to my mind, and I thought about this image right here. I thought about, a lot of us do this. That we get on the hamster wheel in this life, and right ahead of them is money, and we're going like, hey, I'm gonna get money, and if I get a little bit more, I'm gonna feel a little bit more security, I'm gonna feel a little bit better, I can do more things, I'm just gonna keep, and that's gonna lead to happiness. And so we go and we chase and we chase and we chase and we chase. And here's the thing, and please listen in, please lean in. What's so important is there's trickery here. You will fool yourself and actually believe something that's not true. And let me explain. You see, money absolutely provides happiness, up until about $75,000, research says. Because at $75,000, you've got your needs met for the most part. And anything above $75,000 will not add to your happiness at all. You could be Jeff Bezos with billions of dollars. There's no research or data that would indicate that's going to make you any happier at all. And so money, the reason why it's so tricky is because you get the money and then it goes. You get the money and then it goes. And then you got to keep chasing. And then you got to keep chasing because that stimulant of happiness, that feeling of happiness feels good. Same things with drugs and alcohol. Hey, I don't feel good about me, so I'm going to drink a little bit more. I'm going to do some drugs. And in those moments, man, I feel pretty good. I feel like, oh, I finally feel what I desire to feel. The problem with that is you go to bed. And when you wake up the next morning, you feel emptier than you've ever felt. And so you got to get back on that hamster wheel. Or how about pleasure? A little bit of success, a little bit of fame, a little bit of climbing the ladder, a little bit of sex, whatever it is. Maybe a lot. But pleasure fades. And then you got to get back up the next day and go and go and go. And it never fully and finally satisfies. They're stimulants of happiness. They're short-term happiness that keep you on the hamster wheel. And it's a trick. It's fooling your mind. And the reason I say that is because back to Dan Gilbert, the Harvard psychologist. He gives a great TED Talk. I would highly recommend you guys watching the TED Talk. On his TED Talk, the description of TED that summarizes his talk says this. This is so important. Dan Gilbert believes that in our ardent, lifelong pursuit of happiness, most of us have the wrong map. In the same way that optical illusions fool our eyes and fool everyone's eyes in the same way, Gilbert argues that our brains systematically misjudge what will make us happy. And then he concludes this way. And these quirks in our cognition make humans very poor predictors of our own bliss. One of the loneliest moments in your life is when you pursue and you pursue and you pursue the thing that you think is going to deliver the ultimate. And then you get it, and you worked your butt off for it, and it doesn't deliver what you thought. And at that point, you're incredibly, incredibly lonely. That's what Solomon's trying to warn us of. And there's so many examples of this. I'm going to date myself, but think of Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders, I was a fan of him when he's on the Cowboys. Outside of the Cowboys, not a fan of Deion. But on the Cowboys, a fan. And he won the Super Bowl as, a Dallas Cowboy. And if you read about Deion Sanders, after he won the Super Bowl as a Dallas Cowboy, he went home. And he's like, man, this is the ultimate. And he didn't feel it, though. And so what did he do is he's laying in bed after winning the Super Bowl. He goes, maybe there's something else. So he gets on the phone. He orders the most expensive Lamborghini, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Maybe this is going to do it. Hangs up the phone. And he said after he ordered the most expensive car he could get, after he won the Super Bowl, his biggest question was whether or not to commit suicide. Because he had chased so long to deliver something that just wasn't lasting. It wasn't there. And it keeps you on the hamster wheel. And it keeps you moody. Because anything that threatens something that your mind has fooled you that's going to provide happiness, you got to protect it. And when you get it, you get happy. When you don't get it, you get mad. And you protect it like crazy. And you push people away. So, that's quite depressing. So, what's the good news? Ultimately, it brings us to the question. What leads to happiness? If that's what the science says, if that's what the scriptures say, if that's what Solomon says, ultimately what's going to lead to that lasting joy, that lasting contentment? Well, Solomon ends his whole letter, his whole research paper, and he says, let me tell you. He goes, here is my final conclusion. Here's the thing, I have spent years and years and years doing this. Let me tell you what actually leads to happiness. Fear God and obey his commands. For this is the entire duty of man. In other words, Solomon in the letter of Ecclesiastes, this is important. If you ever choose to read the letter, look for the phrase under the sun. That is the key to unlocking Ecclesiastes. Under the sun means anything in this world. Solomon says, I pursued everything the world had to offer, and it's not going to deliver what you think. It's the world. And he says, I'm telling you, if you want lasting, not the stimulant, not the short term that it chases you, keeps you all moody and all these kind of things, the thing that leads to long-term lasting happiness, fear God. Obey his commands. And I love that he put it in this order. First, to fear God. Because if you learn how to fear God, if you move into fearing God, then it's a natural progression to obey his commands. Not as rules and regulations, but as an honest, pure motivation to go, man, I want to because I see who God is clearly. But oftentimes when we hear the words fear God, we think of terror and, oh, man, God's going to judge us. That's not fear. That's a misunderstanding of fear. Fear God simply means to be in awe of God. to be in awe of his majesty, to be in awe of his creation, to be in awe of his unconditional love, to be in awe of his goodness, to look at God and discover who he is more and more and lean into that, and that becomes more personal. And all of a sudden you go, wow, that's who he is. And the more you lean into that, the closer you get to the awe, the wow, the fear of God. The natural progression is to go, of course he would ask me to do that and not to do that. It's for my benefit. It's for my freedom. It's not to oppress me. But you may hear that, and you may go, well, Buck, the problem with the fear of God and the problem with what you're saying and the whole happiness thing is God to me is pretty much of a concept. Like when I hear you say, or preachers or reverends or priests, or when I read it in the Bible, or when I hear people talk about, the awe of God, the fear of God, the majesty of God, it just feels so ethereal. It feels so abstract. It feels so like, it's just not personal to me. And perhaps God understood that and related with that feeling. Because God 2,000 years ago said, well, let me do everything I can to make it personal. And God took on human flesh in the person of Jesus. Jesus is called the God-man. Jesus is called Emmanuel, God with us. And here's a question for you. Do you know why the religious leaders called the Pharisees crucified Jesus? The number one reason why they crucified him. Do you know why? It's because everywhere he went, he kept claiming to be God. I am God in a body. And teaching after teaching, he kept saying, oh, by the way, I'm God, I'm God, I'm God. And eventually they were like, heresy. And they crucified him. Jesus came into the world as God in a body to make it personal. And when Jesus came into the world, here's what's so cool, and here's what connects to happiness. The angel Gabriel announced to the shepherd, this is what we learn during Christmas oftentimes, the angel said, I bring you good news, that when God came into the world, that's good news. It's not bad. He's not coming to judge you. It's good news. That will bring, look at this, great joy to all people. Joy is synonymous with happiness. And here's what I want you to hear. You see, Jesus is the good news that brings you great happiness. Not short-term stimulant kind of happiness that keeps you on the hamster wheel. That Jesus is the one to come into the world for you, and it's good news to provide sustained foundation, perpetual joy, constant contentment. And that's what he's offering to you and to me. That he delights when you delight. That Jesus is the personification of God. It has invited you into something far, far better. Solomon says, you want to know where lasting happiness is? It's not under the sun. It's found in the person of Jesus Christ. So, let's wrap this up, start to think. Are you happy? And I really want you to think about this, genuinely, in your life. Are you happy? Do you have a foundation of contentment, a perpetual sense of joy? And yes, things come and ebb and flow in your way, and you need to be human and feel that. But are you constantly reminded that Jesus is your Savior? That Jesus is your King of all kings? That Jesus is the rock and the refuge? That you have been forgiven of past, present, and future? You don't need to live in your past any longer. Jesus came to offer that for you. So are you happy? Are you happy? And if you're honest with that question, you go, well, Buck, the honest truth, if I'm just really transparent and authentic, it's no. The honest truth is, as you describe the hamster wheel, I'm on that hamster wheel. And I'm chasing and chasing and chasing. And as Dan Gilbert says, I've got the wrong map. It's an illusion. It's a facade. And man, I've been chasing that a long time, and it's pretty darn exhausting. Or maybe you would say, Buck, when it comes to happiness, and if Jesus really is that source of long-term, sustained happiness, if he really is that place, the problem I have with that and the tension I have with that is what you alluded to earlier, is that Jesus to me is a concept. And this is regardless if you're a Christian or not. That when you hear me say things like, Jesus has forgiven you, Jesus is your rock, Jesus is your refuge, Jesus is the one who says in this world, you will face trouble. This is not heaven. Heaven is to come. Quit trying to make heaven here. And you hear Jesus says, in this world you'll have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. Man, that should be incredible news. Where Jesus says, I've come to give you a new identity. Quit struggling for your identity. You've already got one. You've got what it takes. You are beautiful. You are handsome. Man, you're worth it. If you hear me say that, and somewhere in your mind is a Christian or not a Christian, you're like, yeah, I've heard all that before. There's some apathy in there. That is a clear indicator. Jesus is a concept. And please hear me well. Until Jesus becomes personal to you, you will not experience lasting happiness. As long as he is this kind of abstract, distant, or apathetic concept, this happiness is going to be elusive. And what requires someone to be personal is intentionality. If someone's going to become personal, you got to be humble. You got to be intentional. You got to go after it. You got to be curious for someone to become personal, but it makes all the difference. Because think of it this way. If I heard all kinds of things about you, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing story, and there's all kinds of wonderful things, and all these people who know you, man, their lives are benefiting because of you. Wow. And I just know that from a distance. Well, I can know of, and I can hear of all these wonderful things that person has to offer. But it doesn't mean a hill of beans to me because it's a concept. I don't know them personally. But once I begin to have humility and curiosity and intentionality and go, hey, can I spend some time with you? And day after day, it's not overnight, it takes time, and I'm intentional, and I'm asking questions, and I'm discovering, and I'm like, oh my gosh, look at their character, look at their decisions, look at their hardships, they're so inspiring. And then if that person, because now I have a personal relationship and I can call them my friend, if they ask me to do something, it's not burdensome. It's not like, oh man, obedience again. It's like, no, I want to, because they're my friend and I love them. And it's personal. Personal makes all the difference. And I'm telling you, when intentionality is there, when humility is there, when curiosity is there, when we are willing to take steps and move into a personal relationship with Jesus, Jesus becomes our friend. In the scriptures, it's really clear. Not only is he your Savior, but Jesus also desires to be your friend. Somebody that you go, man, I got a personal relationship with them. And once you take steps and move further and further into that personal relationship, Solomon's words, that's where you will find lasting happiness. So, please think about, let me ask you this question. What's just one personal thing you can do to make Jesus more personal to you? Like today, this week, next month, for 2021. The reason why we're doing this series called Nothing Else, and we're concluding it today, is I just simply want nothing else but Jesus for you. I really do. And I want you to think more about Jesus than you've ever thought in your life, because I am utterly convinced the more you think about Jesus, the more he will reveal himself to you. The more Jesus reveals himself to you, the more irresistible he will become. And the more irresistible Jesus becomes to you, the more you will begin to experience what he came. He's good news to give you great happiness. The more you will experience that in your life. So for you, what's one personal thing that you can do to make Jesus more personal to you? And maybe you're here today and maybe you would say, well, Buck, this whole Jesus thing, like I got questions about Jesus. And I'm, these questions are keeping me from having this personal relationship with him. Then I would highly encourage you, one personal thing you can do is what Jordan was talking about with Starting Point. I mean, Starting Point's about to kick off. You can go online and you can go through the Starting Point orientation, ask your questions. I mean, Starting Point is a small group that is the greatest and safest place in the world for you to ask all your questions about Jesus and get to the bottom. Be intentional. Be curious about who he is. Or maybe you're here today and maybe you're a Christian. And maybe, as I talked about the apathy, maybe that's true for you. Maybe you would just go, yeah, every time I hear he forgives or he gives me a new identity or he thinks I'm enough, I'm like, yeah, I've heard that. Really? My goodness. It's Jesus Christ we're talking about. And maybe for you, if that's apathy, I get it. There's an ebb and flow in our relationship. But maybe it's because of a lack of some of the spiritual disciplines. I mean, any personal relationship requires intentionality, requires investment, requires time. And so for you, if you're a follower of Jesus, maybe that's simply just picking up the Bible, reading letters, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all about the life of Jesus. Maybe that's beginning to pray and inviting him into your daily life. Maybe that's serving or giving, I don't know. But maybe the spiritual disciplines, just like in any personal relationship, it requires intentionality. Or maybe a good personal, thing that you can do is read about Jesus. I mean, this whole series is based on this book by Judah Smith called Jesus Is. It's a great book and just begins to give you perspective on who Jesus is. Or read the book by Lee Strobel, Case for Christ. He was an atheist, became a follower of Jesus simply because of the evidence of who Jesus is. And I could go on and on, but one last thing. If you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're not a Christian and you're tuning in today or you're here today, man, one of the greatest personal things you could do to take a step and lean in and say, is this true? Did Jesus come to give me something better? Is to pray a very simple prayer and just say, Jesus, if you're real, would you reveal yourself to me? Because if he is real, he will reveal himself to you. I promise you that. But if you're willing to pray that prayer, I want you to look. I want you to look. Look for his answer because he will answer that prayer. So for you, what's one personal thing you can do to make Jesus more personal to you? Bottom line, a personal Jesus is good news that brings you great happiness, the very thing that we are on a quest to find. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for this moment that we can have these conversations about what you've done in this world and how you've preserved even this letter of Ecclesiastes that gives us so much insight and is not only true 3,000 years ago, but my goodness, all the experiences and stories and quotes from so many people who've gotten to the top of what we're chasing, they tell us the same thing. And so, Father, as we think about this idea of a personal relationship with your son, Jesus, I know that hits all of us at different places. And so, Father, the thing that I ask is that you open our eyes to what is that one personal thing that we can do. Whatever that is, Father, would you give us the wisdom to understand what that is, the courage to actually do it? Because, God, I want so much, and I know you do so much, want us to experience what you have for us. It's good, and it's better. So, Father, give us the courage to lean in and make you more personal to us. In Jesus' name.